They thought I was just the girl down the hall, filing papers so they could sign their names to success. They skipped my biggest night for a fancy dinner, mocking me online. What they did not know was that for the past 2 years, this lowly clerk secretly kept their empire from collapsing. Tonight, while they toasted each other, I finally cut the string feeding them all. I am Olivia Rivera. I am 34 years old, residing in a corner high-rise apartment in Boston, where the relentless hum of the city usually manages to drown out the noise in my own head. Tonight, however, the apartment was completely silent. The digital clock on the oven read 8 o'clock in the evening. I sat on the edge of my gray sofa, staring at the glowing screen of my phone. The family group chat was open. My thumb hovered over the digital keyboard. I had drafted the message 4 different times, painstakingly stripping away any trace of vulnerability, any hint of the desperate child who still lived somewhere deep inside my chest, quietly begging to be seen and validated. I forced my breathing to slow down. I kept the words neutral, almost clinical, treating the invitation like a corporate memo rather than a personal plea. I typed out the exact date, the precise time, and the location. The Sterling Atrium. I mentioned the reason was a professional honoring ceremony. I did not mention the magnitude of the award. I did not explain the millions of dollars I had negotiated or the thousands of jobs I had salvaged from the brink of ruin to earn this recognition. I finished the block of text with a single, light sentence. It would mean a lot if you came. I held my breath, closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, and pressed send. I did not dare to hope. Hope was a highly volatile and dangerous currency in the Rivera family, and I had bankrupted myself on it many years ago. I set the phone face down on the cold glass surface of the coffee table and waited. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The vibration came exactly 2 minutes later. It buzzed violently against the glass, a harsh, grating sound that made my shoulders tense instinctively. My father, Dean Rivera, was always the first to strike. He possessed a predator instinct for spotting weakness. I picked up the phone, the metal casing feeling heavy in my palm. His response was a masterclass in casual cruelty. "Award for what?" he wrote, the lack of punctuation amplifying the disdain. Filing faster than everyone else, a second message followed immediately after, landing like a physical blow. "Do not let it go to your head. You are just a lowly clerk." I read the words twice. The letters blurred slightly on the bright screen. Not from tears, because I had stopped crying over his insults a decade ago, but from the sheer, predictable exhaustion of it all. Just a lowly clerk. It was the exact same dismissive tone he had used when I was 12 years old and won the state debate tournament, asking the room at large if talking back was now considered an Olympic sport. He had a gift for taking any achievement of mine and shrinking it down to a joke. Before I could even fully process the familiar hollow ache spreading in my chest, the screen lit up again. My sister, Brooke Rivera, had eagerly joined the fray. She never missed an opportunity to align herself with the dominant power in the room. And in our family, Dean was the undisputed king. "I cannot make it," she typed rapidly. "I already have plans that evening for something much more important. We are celebrating my new brand partnership. Sorry, not sorry. Cannot change the schedule for a paper-pushing banquet." Brooke was 32 years old, yet her brand of cruelty possessed the precise, unrefined edge of a high school mean girl holding court in a cafeteria. There was absolutely no apology in her words, no polite fiction of regret. There was only the blatant, neon-lit assertion that her existence, her trivial social media milestones, would always entirely eclipse mine. I stared at her message, feeling a dull throb behind my temples. I waited for the final verdict. I waited for the matriarch to weigh in. My mother, Carla Rivera, chimed in precisely 1 minute later. She did not offer a defense. She did not tell my father to soften his words or remind my sister of basic familial decency or obligations. She simply replied with a digital text conveying a thumbs up, a silent, sanitized gesture of complete complicity. That was her signature move. Carla never wielded the knife herself, but she always handed the blade to them and then conveniently looked the other way, pretending there was no blood on the floor. The screen finally went dark, mirroring the sudden drop in my own internal temperature. The silence in the living room rushed back in, feeling thicker and heavier than before. I stood up slowly, leaving the phone on the table as if it were a contaminated object. I walked across the smooth hardwood floor, unlatched the heavy glass sliding door, and stepped out onto the balcony. The Boston night air was sharp, biting, and immediately sobering. The wind whipped off the harbor, cutting straight through the thin silk fabric of my blouse, but I welcomed the freezing sensation. It grounded me in my physical body. I leaned heavily against the metal railing, my bare hands gripping the freezing steel, and looked down at the endless river of headlights winding through the city streets far below. Hundreds of thousands of people down there were rushing home to families who loved them. People who actively asked about their days. People who celebrated their quiet victories with genuine smiles. Standing there, I felt a profound, aching chill settle deep into my bones. But my mind was terrifyingly, brutally clear. They were not merely too busy to attend my event. They were fundamentally and utterly incurious about my life. Over the past decade, they had never once asked for the actual name of my firm, the true nature of my daily responsibilities, or the logical reason I could afford a luxury apartment in one of the most expensive zip codes in the entire state. They did not ask because they absolutely did not want to know. The truth was an inconvenience to their carefully constructed reality. They needed me to be small. They required me to be the lowly clerk, the unremarkable, gray backdrop against which they could brightly project their own grand, fabricated narratives of ultimate success. Dean deeply needed a failure in the family to feel like a titan of industry. Brooke desperately needed a plain, invisible sister to feel like a radiant star. Carla merely needed the comfortable status quo to remain undisturbed at all costs. They had jointly built their entire identities on the solid foundation of my assumed mediocrity. If they ever acknowledged my ascent, their own fragile pedestals would instantly crumble to dust. Suspended above the glowing city, I realized with absolute certainty that this text exchange was not a sudden shock. It was not a rare aberration in their behavior. It was merely the newest, heaviest link, forged in a long chain of disdain that had dragged heavily behind me from early childhood straight into adulthood. I clearly remembered the high school graduations where they arrived 40 minutes late and left before the final speech. I remembered the prestigious college acceptance letters that were met with disinterested shrugs and complaints about tuition costs. I remembered every single quiet achievement I had forcefully swallowed down over the years, because sharing it out loud only ever invited mockery and derision. The immense pain I felt right now was not born from this single, isolated rejection. It was born from the tragic, humiliating realization that after all these years, I was still holding out a cup to a well I knew was bone dry. I had spent my entire existence trying to translate my inherent worth into a language they could understand, foolishly hoping that one day I would earn the basic right to sit at their table as an equal. But the table was rotten to the core. The feast they offered was a complete lie. Slowly, a strange, suffocating weight began to lift from my shoulders, dissipating into the night air. The cold wind filled my lungs, clean and purifying. Anger is usually loud, erratic, and utterly exhausting. What I felt in this precise moment was not anger. It was an absolute glacial detachment. The hurt was still physically there, a compressed, dense stone sitting heavy in my chest, but it was no longer bleeding. It was rapidly solidifying. It was becoming impenetrable armor. I turned away from the sparkling city lights and walked back inside, sliding the glass door shut behind me. The apartment felt artificially warm, but I carried the distinct chill of the balcony with me into the room. I walked straight past the coffee table. I did not pick up the phone. I did not draft a defensive, angry reply. I did not try to desperately explain that the Sterling Atrium was hosting the most prestigious restructuring gala of the entire decade. I did not tell them that my name was the only one printed in bold font on the evening program. I absolutely denied them the satisfaction of my reaction. Reaction was the only currency they fed upon, and as of tonight, their accounts were officially frozen. Instead, I walked over to my home office desk situated in the corner of the room. My laptop was open, glowing softly in the dim light. On the screen was the master digital seating chart for the upcoming gala. The event coordinator had emailed it to me earlier in the afternoon for my final approval. Table number 1, positioned dead center at the very front of the main stage, was reserved exclusively for the Operational Recovery Laureate. It was a large round table designed for 10 guests. I had proudly filled 7 seats with my core executive team, the dedicated people who actually knew the crushing weight of the hundreds of hours we had worked. I had stubbornly left 3 seats completely vacant, holding space for a naive fantasy that had just definitively died on a glass coffee table. I moved the electronic cursor over the 3 empty slots. For a brief second, the cursor blinked steadily. I could easily assign those premium seats to other senior executives. I could fill the entire table and pretend to the room that everything in my world was perfect. But I refused to do that. I clicked the print icon. The heavy laser printer whirred to life, methodically spitting out the thick, glossy paper with the seating arrangement neatly blocked out in black and white. I took a heavy black pen from my top desk drawer, carefully, with deliberate, slow, and perfectly steady strokes. I wrote the word reserved on the 3 empty white circles. I would not fill them. I would let them sit completely empty right at the absolute front of the grand room, bathed in the stage lights. They would serve as a physical monument. It was a final, silent ritual dedicated to the exact people who had never truly been present in my life. Let the empty chairs silently witness the undeniable reality they vehemently refused to see. Let the gaping void they created be the absolute only thing they contributed to my biggest night. The invisible string that had desperately tethered me to their approval, the frayed, worn thread I had foolishly clung to for 34 years, finally and cleanly snapped. I placed the pen down on the desk. The silence in the apartment felt completely different now. It was no longer the heavy, anxious silence of waiting for a scrap of affection. It was the absolute, impenetrable, and peaceful silence of a final ending. To Dean Rivera, Northlight Recovery Partners was nothing more than a glorified paperwork office. Whenever the subject of my employment managed to breach the thick walls of his self-absorption during our mandatory holiday dinners, he would wave his hand dismissively, swirling his expensive scotch, and refer to my workplace as the place where paper goes to die. I never corrected him. I let him picture me sitting in a cramped, windowless cubicle, stamping invoices and organizing color-coded folders for middle managers. The reality of Northlight Recovery Partners was entirely different, and my place within it was a secret I guarded with ruthless precision. We occupied the top 5 floors of a sleek, glass-paneled skyscraper in the financial district. My office did not have cubicle walls. It had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, a sprawling mahogany desk, and a heavy door with a frosted glass plaque that read, Head of Strategic Restructuring. I did not file papers for other people to sign. I dictated the absolute terms that allowed failing empires to breathe again. I was the financial architect who walked into the smoking ruins of collapsing corporations, assessed the damage with cold calculation, and built a firewall to stop the total devastation. For years, I had actively cultivated their misunderstanding. It was not born out of a desire to deceive, but out of a rigid instinct for emotional survival. I learned very early in life that in the Rivera household, any achievement of mine was instantly perceived as an act of profound insolence. A victory for me was somehow translated into a direct threat to my father. If I brought home a flawless academic record, Dean would spend the entire evening criticizing the education system for lowering its standards. If I ever mentioned a promotion, he would loudly wonder about the competence of my superiors. My success was a harsh mirror that reflected his own deep-seated insecurities, and he despised what he saw. Therefore, I learned to shrink. I systematically stripped my job title of its immense weight. I became the invisible helper, the benign clerk, completely neutralizing the threat I posed to his fragile, inflated ego. I had just closed the most exhausting and complex deal of my entire professional career. It involved a massive regional logistics conglomerate that handled shipping and freight across 14 different states. They were on the absolute brink of a cascading bankruptcy. A catastrophic failure of executive leadership and gross mismanagement of funds had left them bleeding cash, mere days away from shuttering warehouses and halting operations entirely. If they fell, the supply chain disruption would have been devastating, and the immediate casualties would have been the livelihoods of exactly 5,400 blue-collar workers. My team and I spent 4 agonizing months locked in corporate war rooms, fueled by bitter black coffee and sheer, unadulterated adrenaline. We tore their financial architecture apart down to the very studs. We implemented aggressive risk management protocols, renegotiated crippling debt structures with ruthless efficiency, and engineered a complete operational pivot. I personally sat across from highly hostile boards of directors and obstinate union leaders, forcing them to swallow bitter pills to ensure their collective survival. When the final ink dried on the restructuring agreement, we had secured an injection of $350 million in emergency capital. We stopped the bleeding. We preserved every single one of those thousands of jobs without shedding a single tear. No one in my family knew a single detail about this monumental task. They did not know about the sleepless nights, the intense, high-stakes negotiations, or the immense pressure of holding thousands of human futures in my hands. To them, I was just quietly shuffling papers across town, making sure the staple was in the top left corner. It was precisely this logistics turnaround that had earned me the Operational Recovery Laureate. In the insular, high-stakes world of corporate restructuring, this award was not a mere participation plaque handed out for perfect attendance. It was the highest possible endorsement of strategic brilliance and operational execution. It signaled to the entire financial sector that the recipient possessed the rare, highly lucrative ability to perform miracles on balance sheets that everyone else had confidently pronounced dead. It was a heavy crown forged in the brutal fires of corporate salvage, and tonight, the industry leaders were gathering to place it firmly on my head. My name had been steadily climbing the ranks of prominence for the past 3 years. If Dean or Brooke had ever bothered to look beyond their own carefully curated social media feeds, they would have easily found me. I was frequently cited in prestigious financial journals. My aggressive recovery strategies were thoroughly analyzed in specialized newsletters dedicated to distressed asset management, but they never read those publications. They existed in a superficial, glittering orbit of luxury lifestyle brands, high society gossip, and local business networking events where Dean could flawlessly play the role of the benevolent, wealthy patriarch. The thought of searching for my name in a serious, intellectual context simply never occurred to them, because their minds had already firmly classified me as utterly unremarkable. Walking through the plush, carpeted corridors of my firm earlier that week, surrounded by senior colleagues who deferred to my judgment and managing partners who actively sought my counsel, the dichotomy of my existence had felt starker and more violently contrasted than ever before. Here, within these glass walls, I was a recognized force of nature. I commanded respect not through loud demands, but through undeniable competence and concrete results. I navigated rooms full of aggressive corporate attorneys and highly skeptical investment bankers with lethal grace. Yet, the moment I stepped into my parents' sprawling suburban house, I was magically transformed back into the quiet, slightly disappointing daughter who was only good for fetching another bottle of wine from the cellar or holding Brooke's designer coat. The profound realization that settled over me was cold, precise, and entirely devoid of self-pity. The greatest tragedy of my life was not simply that my family severely underestimated me. Underestimation is merely a lack of accurate information, a temporary blind spot that can theoretically be corrected with hard evidence. No, the absolute truth was far more sinister and deeply entrenched. The ultimate tragedy was that they had built the entire architecture of their own identities upon the foundational, non-negotiable requirement that I remain permanently beneath them. Dean's booming confidence, his swaggering posture as the highly successful business owner, relied heavily on the stark contrast of my supposed mediocrity. He desperately needed a baseline of failure within the family unit to elevate his own narrative of triumph. Brooke's glittering, chaotic persona as the beautiful, important socialite strictly required a drab, invisible sister to serve as the negative space that made her vibrant colors pop. I was the dark, unremarkable velvet cloth upon which they proudly displayed their imitation diamonds. If they were forced to acknowledge the reality of my life, if they were forced to look at the head of strategic restructuring, who commanded hundreds of millions of dollars and single-handedly saved entire corporate ecosystems, the resulting shockwave would completely shatter their carefully constructed delusions. They did not just casually ignore my immense potential. They actively and systematically suppressed it, starving it of light and air, because my genuine ascension would mean their ultimate displacement. They needed the lowly clerk. The clerk was a safe, known entity. The clerk asked for absolutely nothing, threatened no one, and expected nothing in return. I had spent so many years meticulously curating a smaller, significantly safer version of myself to protect them from the blinding glare of my own light. I had swallowed my fierce pride, buried my massive victories, and quietly accepted their endless condescension as the unavoidable, heavy tax I had to pay for a microscopic shred of family harmony. But harmony built on a rotting foundation of suppression is just a prolonged hostage situation disguised as domestic peace. They honestly thought they understood every single facet of Olivia Rivera. They thought they had successfully mapped my intellectual limitations and securely fenced me into a quiet, easily manageable corner of their vibrant, noisy world. They were absolutely certain that the pathetic woman they had mocked in their cruel text messages was exactly who I was. Their supreme, unshakable arrogance was their greatest vulnerability. By willfully blinding themselves to my reality, by aggressively refusing to see the immense power I wielded every single day in the brutal, unforgiving arena of corporate finance, they had left their own flanks completely exposed. They believed I was walking onto the battlefield completely unarmed. They had absolutely no idea that I secretly controlled the entire arsenal. The label was slapped onto me when I was exactly 12 years old. It happened on a Tuesday evening in our sprawling colonial-style kitchen. I had just proudly presented a group history project where I had organized the research, assigned the roles, and practically written the entire script for my classmates. My father glanced at the rubric, took a sip of his iced bourbon, and casually declared that I was a wonderful helper. He said I lacked the natural magnetism required for true leadership, but I was exceptionally good at supporting the people who did have it. That single sentence, delivered with the casual authority of a judge handing down a life sentence, became the blueprint for my entire existence in his house. I was the reliable assistant, the sturdy scaffolding, the girl who handed over the nails so someone else could build the mansion. This classification system was rigorously enforced through a staggering double standard that governed every interaction under our roof. Whenever Brooke made a catastrophic mistake, it was instantly rebranded as an endearing display of her vibrant personality. If she crashed a car at 17, she was just spirited and going through a phase. If she failed a semester of college, she was merely an artistic soul stifled by rigid academic structures. But whenever I exceeded expectations, the narrative shifted to undermine me. If I brought home perfect grades, Dean would sigh and say I was obsessively trying to prove myself because I lacked natural charm. If I won a state-level academic competition, my mother would call it a stroke of pure luck, gently warning me not to let a minor victory make me arrogant. My excellence was a symptom of a personality defect. My sister's failures were undeniable proof of her sparkling humanity. Brooke was the undisputed golden child, because she fit seamlessly into the glossy, manufactured image of the Rivera family. Dean loved to parade her around at country club mixers and corporate holiday parties. She was undeniably beautiful, breathtakingly loud, and possessed an uncanny ability to read a room and tell wealthy men exactly what they wanted to hear. She was the gleaming hood ornament on my father's luxury sedan. I, on the other hand, was the engine buried deep under the hood, coated in grease and completely invisible, expected to do the heavy lifting while she caught all the admiring glances. I learned very early that bringing my genuine self into those brightly lit rooms only resulted in being ushered back into the shadows. So, I adapted. I learned the immense, protective power of absolute silence. While Brooke spent her teenage years demanding attention and throwing dramatic tantrums that held the entire household hostage, I quietly retreated to the periphery. I watched them. I studied the way my father manipulated investors over the phone. I observed the way my mother traded social currency at charity luncheons. I absorbed every brutal lesson about power, leverage, and human weakness that played out in our living room. I became an empty vessel, diligently filling myself with hard skills, legal knowledge, and financial literacy. I knew the applause in that house would never be directed at me, so I stopped performing for their audience. I started working solely for my own future, building an impenetrable fortress of competence brick by tedious brick. The architecture of this emotional abuse would never have held up without my mother. Carla Rivera was not the one shouting insults or making overt comparisons, but her passive complicity was its own specific brand of violence. Whenever Dean diminished my accomplishments or elevated Brooke at my expense, Carla would simply sip her tea and look out the window. Her silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered any chance of rebellion. By refusing to intervene, by never once telling her husband that he was destroying one daughter to inflate the other, she established his cruelty as the absolute, unquestionable law of the land. She taught me that seeking justice or fairness from the people who were supposed to protect me was a completely futile endeavor. Growing up steeped in this toxic favoritism, Brooke naturally came to view me as nothing more than a highly convenient household appliance. I was the sister who was always available to quietly fix the messes she left in her wake. I was the one who wrote her apology emails when she offended her friends. I was the one who balanced her checkbook when she inevitably overdrew her accounts buying designer handbags. She expected my constant, unwavering support as a basic human right, completely divorced from any obligation to offer me respect or gratitude in return. I was the drab, gray backdrop against which her colorful life was projected. She only remembered I existed when she needed something repaired, organized, or paid for. The deepest, most agonizing pain of my life did not stem from any single insult Dean threw at me, nor did it come from Brooke's endless vanity or Carla's cowardly silence. The true bleeding wound was the horrifying realization of my own desperate complicity. For over 2 decades, I had secretly, pathetically harbored the hope that if I just worked hard enough, if I became useful enough, if I solved enough of their problems, they would finally look at me and see someone worthy of love. I had actively participated in my own subjugation. I had allowed them to wear me down into something small and manageable, because I was starving for even the smallest crumb of their affection. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a seat at a table where the chairs were deliberately designed to break under my weight, standing alone in my apartment on the night of my greatest professional triumph, letting the cold reality of their rejection wash over me. The final veil dropped. I did not feel a sudden, fiery explosion of rage. Rage is an emotion reserved for people who still believe they have been wronged by those capable of doing right. What I felt was a profound, chilling clarity. I finally understood that the fundamental issue was not my father's arrogance or my sister's selfishness. The issue was the sprawling, parasitic system they had built, a system completely dependent on my endless willingness to play the role of the quiet, dependable helper. For years, I had been the load-bearing pillar of their manufactured reality. I had absorbed their financial shocks, cleaned up their administrative disasters, and provided the stable foundation they needed to continue living their reckless, glamorous lives. And they repaid me by ensuring I remained small, invisible, and utterly disregarded. But a system only functions as long as the foundation holds. The epiphany hit me with the force of a freight train. I did not need to scream, demand apologies, or force them to see my worth. I simply needed to stop being the pillar. I needed to step out from underneath the crushing weight of their expectations and watch with cold detachment as the entire rotting structure finally collapsed under its own profound emptiness. The sterling atrium was a cavernous space of vaulted glass and polished marble, designed specifically to make the people inside feel as though they were standing at the very center of the universe. I arrived exactly at 7:30 in the evening. I wore a floor-length, tailored black dress completely devoid of any sequins, lace, or unnecessary embellishments. It was architectural, severe, and functioned perfectly as a suit of armor. I stepped through the grand double doors entirely alone, my posture rigid, my expression locked into a state of absolute, unbreakable calm. The air inside hummed with the low, rich murmur of the financial elite. There was the constant clinking of crystal flutes, the soft rustle of expensive silk, and the heavy scent of aged leather and imported orchids. As I navigated the crowded foyer, the sea of dark suits and elegant evening gowns naturally parted. These were the apex predators of the corporate world, the managing partners of global equity firms, and the chief executives of multinational conglomerates. They did not look past me. They caught my eye, smiled with genuine professional deference, and extended their hands. "Good evening," they said, addressing me exclusively by my formal title. They congratulated me on navigating the hazardous debt markets over the past 12 months. They quietly referenced the specific union negotiations I had salvaged and the hostile board takeovers I had masterminded. Every handshake, every nod of respect from these titans of industry served to highlight the 3 glaringly empty chairs at my table. I could easily see the thick black ink spelling out the word reserved on those pristine white placards from across the room. The sight was bitter, a sharp sting of what should have been, yet simultaneously, it felt incredibly hollow. Those empty seats held absolutely no power over me anymore. They were merely ghosts attending a banquet meant solely for the living. 4 miles away, in the heart of the boutique dining district, a completely different performance was being broadcasted live to the world. Velvet Ash was the kind of restaurant that prioritized its lighting aesthetic over the quality of its food. A velvet-lined cavern designed strictly for people who desperately needed to be seen spending money. My sister had secured the largest booth in the center of the main floor. She had positioned her smartphone on a sleek portable tripod, the glaring ring light washing out the ambient glow of the dining room. She was currently live streaming what she proudly dubbed her family success dinner to her 85,000 devoted followers. Brooke leaned into the camera lens, tossing her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder. Her lips painted a vibrant, aggressive shade of crimson. She flashed a practiced, dazzling smile and laughed a high, musical note that carried over the background jazz. "Oh my God, you guys are so sweet," she crooned to the scrolling chat. "We are just celebrating my new brand launch tonight. My sister could not make it. Unfortunately, she pouted her lips in a grotesque pantomime of sympathy. She is at some corporate banquet getting a participation plaque for office clerks. I swear, they give out awards for literally just filing documents and answering phones nowadays." A rapid flurry of laughing emojis and mocking comments quickly scrolled up the right side of her screen. Brooke giggled, feeding off the blind validation of thousands of strangers, completely oblivious to the sheer absurdity of her cruelty. At that exact moment, my father leaned into the frame. He was wearing his custom-tailored navy blazer, his silver hair swept back, projecting the absolute image of a seasoned tycoon. He raised his glass of expensive red wine toward the camera lens, a smug, self-satisfied smirk settling comfortably onto his features. "Let me tell you something," he announced in his booming, authoritative voice, performing for an audience he could not even see. "People who never run anything, people who never take actual risks, they absolutely love certificates. They need little pieces of paper to tell them they are doing a good job, because they do not have the guts to build an actual empire." He took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine, thoroughly pleased with his own profound wisdom. He had unconsciously repeated the exact same philosophy that had been used to crush my spirit since I was a child. To him, my entire existence was a punchline, a cautionary tale of mediocrity used to elevate his own fabricated legend. And seated quietly next to him, dipping a piece of artisan bread into a bowl of seasoned olive oil, my mother smiled serenely at the camera, perfectly content to let the public execution proceed without a single objection. The grand ballroom at the Sterling Atrium suddenly plunged into darkness. Save for the brilliant spotlight sweeping across the main stage, the ambient chatter instantly died down, replaced by a tense, anticipatory silence. I took my seat at the head of Table 1, flanked by my fiercely loyal executive team, the master of ceremonies, a highly respected financial journalist, stepped up to the acrylic podium. We are gathered tonight to honor an individual whose strategic brilliance and unflinching nerve have single-handedly rewritten the rules of corporate salvage, the presenter began, his voice echoing through the massive sound system. When a supply chain network valued at over $800 million was mere hours away from total collapse, threatening to decimate the regional economy, this woman did not flinch. She stepped into the chaos. She functioned as the ultimate strategic architect, tearing down a corrupted financial structure and rebuilding it into an impregnable fortress. She navigated treacherous waters, faced down impossible odds, and ultimately engineered a miraculous recovery that will be studied in business schools for the next 2 decades. I sat perfectly still in the darkness, listening to the booming voice articulate my exact worth to a room full of the most powerful people in the city. Every single word was a meticulously crafted brick, building a monumental testament to my genuine capabilities. I was not a helper. I was not a lowly clerk. I was the architect. I was the savior of dying empires. I heard the exact definition of my value ringing out through the cavernous hall, and for the very first time in my 34 years of life, I did not need a single person from my family to validate it. "Please welcome to the stage," the presenter commanded, his voice rising to a powerful crescendo, "our operational recovery laureate, Olivia Rivera." The entire ballroom erupted. It was not a polite, reserved smattering of applause. It was a thunderous, standing ovation. 400 industry leaders pushed back their chairs and rose to their feet, the sound of their applause echoing like a physical force against the marble walls. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my minimalist black dress. I walked toward the glowing steps of the stage with slow, measured strides. As I reached the podium and looked out over the sea of faces illuminated by the stage lights, I did not feel a sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. I did not feel the prickle of hot tears behind my eyes. I did not feel the desperate, lifelong urge to look over my shoulder and search for my father's approving nod or my mother's comforting smile. What washed over me instead was a terrifying absolute clarity. It was a cold, pure awakening, entirely devoid of any residual sentimentality. The 3 empty chairs in the front row were no longer symbols of my personal rejection. They were a definitive, legally binding verdict. The people sitting in that velvet-lined booth across town, laughing into a smartphone camera and mocking the very hands that secretly held up their fragile world, had made their final choice. They had not merely chosen to skip a fancy dinner. They had not just missed a career milestone or a prestigious industry ceremony. By choosing to abandon me tonight, by loudly and publicly reaffirming their absolute contempt for my existence, they had missed their absolute final opportunity to act like a family. They had gleefully walked past the last available exit ramp on a highway leading straight into a concrete wall. I placed my hands firmly on the edges of the podium, feeling the cool, solid acrylic beneath my palms. I looked out at the brilliant, blinding lights. The applause continued to roar, a deafening wave of genuine recognition. I took a deep breath, letting the terrifying clarity settle deep into my bones. The bridge connecting me to the Rivera family had not just burned down, I had just personally swept up the ashes and thrown them into the freezing wind. I stepped forward to the microphone, absolutely ready to claim what was mine, fully aware that when tomorrow morning arrived, I was going to systematically dismantle everything that was theirs. 2 years ago, the meticulously polished facade of Rivera Mason Atelier began to crack under the immense weight of its own operational incompetence. My father liked to introduce himself as a visionary architect of commercial spaces, but the reality of his business model was far less glamorous. He ran his firm not as a functioning enterprise, but as a personal treasury designed exclusively to fund his ego. He bled his own company dry through chronic mismanagement, ostentatious overhead, and a fatal habit of alienating his best subcontractors by delaying payments for 90 or sometimes even 120 days. When the commercial real estate market experienced a slight contraction, his fragile house of cards immediately buckled. His balance sheet was a graveyard of toxic liabilities. No reputable financial institution was willing to extend him even a single dollar of credit. Commercial banks took one look at his audited financials, saw the glaring red flags of high executive compensation paired with plummeting revenue, and firmly shut their heavy vault doors. Yet, while his accounts payable department dodged furious phone calls from suppliers, Dean continued to operate exactly as he always had. He still leased a brand new luxury vehicle every 12 months. He still hosted lavish catered events at the country club, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge the gaping abyss opening up right beneath his Italian leather shoes. I sat in my office late one evening, reviewing the bankruptcy filings of a competitor in his sector, and I knew exactly what was coming for him. I also knew exactly who would bear the brunt of the impact. It would not be Dean. Men like my father always managed to parachute to safety, landing softly on hidden offshore accounts or liquidating quiet assets. The true victims would be the innocent people occupying the lower floors of Rivera Mason Atelier. The draftsmen, the project managers, the administrative assistants, and the junior designers would be the ones locked out of the building on a random Tuesday, their healthcare severed and their final paychecks bouncing. I refuse to let hundreds of hardworking professionals lose their livelihoods simply because they had the misfortune of being employed by a narcissist. So, I engineered a highly classified intervention. I did not intervene out of a blind, dutiful sense of daughterly love. I did it to buy time, to protect the vulnerable workforce, and most importantly, to establish absolute control over the blast radius if the detonation ever became inevitable. Using a portion of my own accumulated capital and leveraging my extensive network in the distressed debt sector, I quietly established a separate, anonymous legal entity. I named it Harbor Vale Capital. Through a trusted third-party intermediary, a bulldog attorney who specialized in discreet corporate acquisitions, Harbor Vale Capital approached Rivera Mason Atelier with a lifeline. We offered to purchase his non-performing debt and provide a senior secured revolving credit facility to stabilize his operations. We were essentially buying his company's survival. However, the financing agreement was not a standard, friendly loan. It was a highly sophisticated, rigorously structured trap, disguised as a rescue package. The contract I drafted was a masterpiece of forensic financial restriction. It contained dozens of ironclad negative covenants. I explicitly forbade the withdrawal of any operational funds for personal spending or executive bonuses. I included a strict prohibition against transferring any corporate assets into the names of family members. I legally blocked the use of revolving capital for any luxury expenses, unapproved marketing campaigns, or personal travel. Every single dollar injected by Harbor Vale Capital was legally tethered to the core survival of the business operations, tracked and monitored with ruthless precision. When my intermediary presented the massive stack of legal documents to my father, Dean barely glanced at the terms. He did not read the dense paragraphs on page 42 detailing the severe consequences of a covenant breach. His towering arrogance completely blinded him to the intricate web I was spinning around his wrists. In his mind, he was simply too important to fail. He fundamentally believed that there would always be some foolish, overly eager institutional investor ready to hand him cash just for the privilege of associating with the Rivera brand. He eagerly signed his name on the dotted line, officially handing over the master keys to his kingdom, utterly convinced he had just outsmarted the system once again. The sudden influx of liquidity did not serve as a wake-up call for my family. It served as gasoline poured directly onto the fire of their delusions. My sister, completely ignorant of the precarious financial engineering keeping the lights on, interpreted the sudden resumption of cash flow as definitive proof that our father was an invincible titan of industry. Brooke immediately doubled down on her extravagant lifestyle. She maxed out her credit limits. Assuming the company coffers were overflowing once more, she aggressively expanded her shallow social media presence, broadcasting a lifestyle of unlimited wealth, completely unaware that every single designer handbag and luxury vacation was being indirectly funded by the restrictive grace of a silent creditor she openly despised. The beauty of the Harbor Vale capital structure was its total anonymity. The holding company was registered in a state that did not require the public disclosure of beneficial owners. The legal correspondence was handled entirely by a boutique firm in Chicago, completely isolating me from the day-to-day interactions with my father's chief financial officer. Whenever Dean's accounting department submitted their monthly compliance certificates, they were sending them into a black box, completely unaware that the person scrutinizing their cash flow statements was the exact same woman they had mocked at the Thanksgiving dinner table. I reviewed those ledgers with the dispassionate, surgical precision of a coroner examining a corpse. I saw the pathetic attempts to disguise personal expenditures as legitimate business costs. I saw the highly questionable consulting fees paid to Brooke for marketing services she never actually rendered. I watched them slowly and systematically edge closer and closer to the tripwires I had hidden deep within the master credit agreement. They were dancing blindfolded on the edge of a cliff, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the one holding the safety harness, and I was the one who could simply let go. For 24 months, I maintained absolute, unbroken silence. I watched from the shadows as they squandered the second chance I had secretly manufactured for them. I made a silent pact with myself during those 2 years. I told myself that I would not pull the trigger. I promised myself that as long as they treated me with a baseline level of human decency, just the bare minimum required of a family, I would allow their artificial ecosystem to continue functioning. I did not demand apologies for the past. I did not require them to suddenly understand my career or validate my intellect. I simply required them to stop actively tearing me down. I required them to show up. But that was the one impossible condition. By funding their survival, I had inadvertently funded the very arrogance they used to crush me. The system I had painstakingly designed to save innocent employees had ultimately become the exact mechanism that enabled my family to continue treating me like a disposable subordinate. I had given them the financial runway to prove their character, and they had used every single inch of it to accelerate their cruelty. The secret I held was no longer just a financial safety net. It was a loaded weapon, sitting quietly in my desk drawer, waiting for the precise moment they finally crossed the point of no return. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom closed softly behind me, completely severing the lingering sound of the string quartet and the warm, overlapping conversations of the financial elite. I did not remain for the opulent post-ceremony champagne reception. I bypassed the exclusive VIP lounge entirely, politely but firmly declining the eager offers of celebratory drinks from senior partners and industry rivals who had just witnessed my ascension. My privately hired town car was already idling at the designated curb, its powerful engine emitting a low, barely perceptible hum against the sharp, biting night air. The chauffeur stepped forward immediately, opening the heavy rear door. I slid into the expansive, perfectly soundproofed cabin, the thick, premium leather seats absorbing the rigid physical tension I had carried onto the brightly lit stage. As the luxury vehicle pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging effortlessly into the late evening traffic, the glittering, triumphant facade of the venue quickly faded into the distance behind me. I reached down into my structured leather briefcase and extracted my laptop. The interior of the car was completely dark, save for the sudden, crisp, blue glow of the high-definition screen illuminating my face. I deliberately bypassed my standard corporate email client and routed my internet connection through a heavily encrypted, military-grade virtual private network. I then entered the highly secure administrative portal for my private holding firm. A biometric fingerprint scan and a randomized, continuously generating 16-digit alphanumeric passcode granted me master administrative access. The proprietary dashboard materialized instantly on the screen. It was not a chaotic, colorful spread of generic financial graphs. It was a minimalist, highly functional, an utterly sterile interface designed purely for absolute surveillance and total control. Immediately, an aggressively pulsing red indicator caught my direct attention in the upper right quadrant of the screen. It was a critical, automated compliance alert tied directly to the master operating account of my father's enterprise. I clicked the urgent notification, expanding the real-time, itemized transaction ledger. My eyes scanned the sterile, perfectly aligned rows of digital data. What I saw was not a minor, easily explainable accounting error or a simple, misclassified vendor payment. It was a brazen, catastrophic, and completely intentional raid on the legally restricted capital reserves. At exactly 8:15 that evening, a massive authorization hold had been placed by Velvet Ash, the exact high-end restaurant where my sister was currently holding court. The amount was absolutely staggering, easily sufficient to cover the commercial lease of a small, functioning warehouse property for an entire month. But the grotesque culinary extravagance was merely the beginning of the bleeding. Right beneath the massive restaurant charge were two freshly cleared, high-priority wire transfers. One was aggressively directed to a boutique public relations firm specializing exclusively in influencer brand launches and social media management. The other was routed immediately to a luxury event production agency, designated specifically for custom floral installations and bespoke atmospheric lighting. These substantial disbursements had been yanked directly, without any hesitation, from the primary revolving credit facility. This was the exact, highly guarded pool of liquidity I had legally ring-fenced exclusively for mandatory payroll, essential raw materials, and critical, overdue subcontractor invoices. Dean had not merely bought an outrageously expensive dinner to celebrate his golden child. He had actively and knowingly siphoned legally restricted corporate survival funds to bankroll Brooks' shallow vanity project, effectively financing the very stage from which they were actively broadcasting their public contempt for me. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the maneuver was breathtaking in its scope. He had signed a legally binding, meticulously detailed document expressly forbidding the diversion of these specific funds for personal use or unapproved marketing expenditures. Yet, operating under the lifelong, deeply ingrained assumption that rules and consequences were meant solely for lesser people, he had simply handed over the corporate card without a single second thought. This was the absolute, definitive tipping point. The live stream mockery I had endured earlier in the evening was a profound moral failure, a disgusting, highly public display of their ingrained cruelty and lack of character. But this digital ledger glowing on my screen, this was something entirely different. This was a clear, undeniable, and legally terminal breach of a strict, highly punitive financial covenant. I sat back against the smooth leather headrest. The cabin of the car was completely flawlessly silent. I took a slow, deep, and perfectly measured breath. I did not feel the hot, stinging rush of tears that typically accompanies a profound family betrayal. My hands, resting lightly on the cold aluminum chassis of the keyboard, did not tremble even a fraction of a millimeter. There was absolutely no internal, agonizing monologue debating the sanctity of bloodlines or the inherent duty of a loyal daughter. I felt absolutely nothing but the pure, surgical, and terrifying coldness of a professional executioner calmly reading over a finalized, irreversible warrant. I navigated smoothly to the Covenant Enforcement tab, securely nested within the portal. I opened the Master Credit Agreement document and scrolled down directly to Article 8, Section 4, Paragraph C. The legal language was stark and utterly unambiguous. I read the termination clauses one final time, confirming with absolute certainty that the financial threshold for immediate, punitive action had been crossed by a margin of several thousand%. I moved the digital cursor deliberately over the primary command console. It required exactly 2 clicks to initiate the total financial lockdown. The first click formally activated the springing lockbox provision. It was a brutal, uncompromising banking mechanism designed specifically for highly distressed, fundamentally untrustworthy debtors. I watched the loading bar slide across the center of the screen. Within milliseconds, an automated, irrevocable directive was fired directly to the primary banking syndicate handling the firm's accounts. It instantly and permanently revoked Dean's administrative access. Every single dollar of incoming corporate revenue would now automatically bypass his control entirely, sweeping directly into a secure holding account managed and monitored exclusively by my firm. Simultaneously, the protocol placed a hard, unbreakable freeze on all existing corporate credit cards and subordinate executive spending limits. The financial arteries of his entire company were cleanly severed with a single, effortless keystroke. The second click dispatched the formal, legally binding notice of acceleration. The software system automatically generated a highly detailed, electronically certified legal document and blasted it directly to the inbox of his chief financial officer, his external general counsel, and his personal accounting team. The notice officially declared a terminal, uncurable default. It legally demanded the immediate, full repayment of the entire outstanding principal loan balance, plus all accrued penalty interest, within exactly 12 hours. It was a colossal sum of money that I knew for an absolute fact he did not possess. The screen refreshed seamlessly. The flashing red alert vanished instantly, replaced by a solid, calming green confirmation banner. The sweep was entirely active. The lockbox was fully engaged. The legal notices were successfully delivered. I gently closed the laptop, the sudden, comforting darkness washing over the back seat of the car once again. I turned my head to look out the heavily tinted window. The luxury vehicle was gliding smoothly down the brightly illuminated, historic avenues of Boston, passing row after row of glowing street lamps, bustling sidewalks, and towering glass corporate facades. For my entire existence, my relationship with my family had been strictly governed by a toxic, deeply entrenched, and unchanging habit. They took endlessly, they mocked relentlessly, they consumed greedily, and I quietly absorbed the devastating impact. I had been the silent, highly effective shock absorber for their endless, spiraling dysfunction. But as the vibrant city lights blurred past my window, a profound, chilling, and permanent peace settled deeply into the center of my chest. I had just entirely dismantled the shock absorber. I had definitively stopped subsidizing their blatant disrespect with my own hard-earned capital. From this exact second forward, the Rivera family dynamic, as it had always existed, was officially dead. The long, agonizing era of blind indulgence, unearned luxury, and endless second chances had been permanently terminated by a silent digital sweep. Tomorrow morning, when the sun rose over the city and the financial institutions opened their heavy doors, my father and my sister would wake up to a completely alien, terrifying reality. They were no longer operating in a soft, forgiving world shielded by habit or protected by my silent, unrewarded endurance. They were finally, inescapably, entering the brutal, unforgiving world of absolute consequences. I settled deeper into the premium leather seat of the town car and opened the social media application on my phone. I navigated directly to Brooke's public profile. The bright red circle indicating an active live broadcast was still glowing steadily at the top of the screen. I tapped the icon. I did not want to miss the exact moment the suffocating illusion they had forced me to live under for my entire life finally shattered into pieces. Through the harsh, artificial glare of Brooke's portable ring light, Velvet Ash looked exactly like a gaudy, overproduced theater set. Half-eaten plates of expensive truffle risotto and empty Wagyu beef sliders littered the expansive, dark wood table. The waiter, a tall young man wearing a crisp white shirt and a tailored black vest, approached their booth. He carried a sleek black leather folio containing the final bill, the total cost for the imported vintage wine, the sprawling feast, and the custom decorative desserts would easily rival the monthly rent of a modest city apartment. Dean barely looked up from his self-important monologue. He confidently reached into the breast pocket of his tailored navy blazer, retrieved his heavy metal corporate card, and tossed it carelessly onto the silver tray. Brooke was entirely distracted, busy adjusting her hair for the camera lens and giggling at the rapidly scrolling comments from her thousands of devoted viewers. The waiter walked away toward the register, but he returned less than 3 minutes later. His posture was rigid, and his facial expression was deeply uncomfortable. He leaned down, placing the leather folio back on the table, and whispered something discreetly to my father. Dean let out a booming, arrogant laugh that echoed harshly through my phone speaker. He waved his hand dismissively in the air, loudly telling the young man that the restaurant's banking machine must be experiencing a glitch. He ordered the waiter to run the magnetic strip a second time. The waiter stood his ground, his voice slightly louder and significantly more strained now, apologizing profusely, but stating clearly that the merchant provider had returned a hard decline code on the account. Dean's arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He snatched the heavy card from the tray, muttering angrily about incompetent commercial banking systems, and pulled his smartphone from his pocket. He fully intended to call his private wealth manager and demand an immediate, groveling override. Instead, his thumb froze completely still over the glowing glass screen. Even through the compressed video feed, I could vividly see the sudden, violent shift in his physical posture. He had just opened an automated, high-priority email from his primary commercial lender. The message plainly stated that his short-term credit facilities and all associated corporate charge cards had been unilaterally suspended to preserve the financial collateral of a senior secured creditor. He stared blindly at the screen, his brow furrowing in deep, genuine confusion, entirely unable to process a reality where his limitless access to capital was suddenly and firmly denied. At that precise moment, Brooke's secondary phone, the device she kept on the table to monitor trending news feeds and celebrity gossip, vibrated loudly against the wood. A dedicated follower in her live chat had just pasted a link to a breaking financial news wire. Brooke, always eager for fresh content to react to, leaned forward and excitedly squinted at the screen. "Let us see what is happening in the world tonight," she chirped to her audience, completely oblivious to the impending detonation. Oh, someone sent a link about a corporate award banquet. She began to read the headline out loud, her tone dripping with casual condescension. Operational recovery. Laureate awarded to the brilliantly strategic. Her voice instantly died in her throat. She stopped speaking completely. The silence that rapidly descended over her corner of the booth was sudden, heavy, and absolute. She instinctively pulled the device much closer to her face, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. She read the first paragraph silently, her jaw slightly slackening, the polished influencer mask completely slipping off her face. The article featured a high-resolution photograph of me standing confidently at the acrylic podium, bathed in the brilliant stage lights, looking entirely in command of the massive room. Beneath the photograph, the bold text identified me not as a lowly office clerk, but as the head of strategic restructuring for Northlight Recovery Partners. It detailed my highly specialized position as a senior executive who dictated life-or-death terms to failing corporations. The massive, undeniable discrepancy between the pathetic caricature she had just painted for her followers and the concrete, documented reality staring back at her caused a complete short circuit in her brain. "What is it?" Dean snapped, deeply irritated by her sudden silence and still desperately grappling with his locked credit card. Brooke wordlessly pushed her phone across the table. Dean snatched the device from her trembling hand. He began to read the main body of the article. The financial journalist had thoroughly detailed my recent, massive victory. The text praised my flawless execution of springing lockboxes, aggressive covenant enforcement, and the strategic utilization of anonymous holding companies to purchase distressed debt and force immediate structural changes. As Dean read those specific, highly technical financial terms, all the blood rapidly drained from his face. His skin turned a sickly, pale shade of gray. Those were the exact, distinctive mechanisms outlined in the Harbor Vale Capital Rescue Agreement he had casually signed 2 years ago. The terrifying, inescapable geometry of the trap finally materialized in his mind. He realized he was not reading an article about a stranger. He was reading the operational playbook of his own executioner. Before he could even articulate a single syllable of his horror, his own phone erupted with alerts in his hand. It was a frantic, terrifying text message from his chief financial officer. I knew exactly what the message said, because I had legally triggered the notification myself just minutes prior. The accountant was reporting a catastrophic, company-wide systemic failure. The master operating account was completely locked. The controlling creditor had legally invoked their absolute right to sweep every single dollar of tomorrow morning's cash flow. Furthermore, the controlling party had issued a formal legal demand requiring a comprehensive, forensic explanation for all corporate capital recently diverted to unapproved personal marketing and luxury lifestyle expenses. The deadline for full compliance was strictly set at 12 hours. Failure to comply would result in immediate, forced asset liquidation. My mother, Carla, had been sitting quietly in the corner of the booth, sipping the very last drop of her expensive red wine. She looked at her husband's ashen, terrified face, then down at her daughter's trembling hands. She leaned over the table and read the glowing screen of the abandoned phone. For the very first time in my entire life, I saw the thick, impenetrable veil of her willful ignorance violently torn away. She looked absolutely paralyzed. She realized, in one blinding flash of absolute horror, that the lavish, comfortable lifestyle she desperately clung to, the expensive designer clothes she wore, and the very meal currently digesting in her stomach, had been entirely funded by the quiet, unacknowledged mercy of the daughter she had allowed them to casually abuse for decades. She realized that the silent valve keeping their lungs filled with air was firmly gripped in my hand, and I had just twisted it completely shut. The most profoundly poetic element of the entire disaster was that Brooke, in her state of total, paralyzing shock, had completely forgotten to end the live broadcast. The bright ring light continued to shine its unforgiving beam directly onto their panicked, devastated faces. 85,000 people were actively watching the wealthy, arrogant Rivera family completely implode right in the middle of their decadent dessert course. The live comment section, which just minutes ago had been filled with fawning praise and cruel jokes at my expense, instantly transformed into a relentless, brutal wave of public scrutiny. Viewers aggressively asked why the black credit card was declined. They asked why the supposedly powerful father looked like he was about to suffer a medical emergency. They linked the financial article in the chat and loudly asked if the highly successful sister they had just publicly insulted was actually the one paying for the very food on their plates. I watched my father frantically waving down the waiter, patting his pockets for a personal credit card he knew perfectly well was already at its maximum limit. I watched my sister staring blankly at the rapidly scrolling comments, her entire manufactured digital empire crumbling into dust before her eyes. I watched my mother sitting as still as a stone statue, suffocating under the crushing, undeniable weight of her own complicity. They were entirely stripped of their assumed power, their unearned pride, and their comforting illusions. They were completely exposed to the unforgiving, brutal judgment of the public square they had always so desperately craved. The grand performance was officially over. I pressed the screen of my phone, closing the application entirely, and let the quiet, soothing darkness of the moving car wash over me. My heart was not racing. My hands were perfectly steady. I felt an overwhelming sense of profound, immaculate order. The sleek town car was navigating the quiet residential streets when the glowing screen of my phone shattered the darkness of the cabin. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times. I watched the digital letters pulse against the black background. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool air of the climate control system against my skin, and pressed the green icon to accept the call. I brought the device to my ear but said absolutely nothing. I let the open line stretch between us. On the other end, the ambient noise of a busy city parking lot leaked through the speaker. I could hear the distant roar of a revving engine and the sharp click of Brooke's designer heels pacing rapidly on the concrete pavement. Then, Dean spoke. The booming, arrogant baritone that had dictated the reality of my entire life was completely gone. It was replaced by a thin, reedy frequency. It was the frantic, breathless sound of a man who had just stepped onto a staircase in the dark and found nothing but empty air beneath his foot. "Olivia," he stammered, his breath catching in his throat. He did not ask how my evening went. He did not ask about the award. His mind was entirely consumed by the catastrophic collapse of his empire. "Tell me you have nothing to do with Harbor Vale Capital. Tell me this is just some insane coincidence. Tell me why my chief financial officer is screaming that an anonymous holding company just locked down my entire operational treasury on the exact same night you are standing on a stage accepting a restructuring award." His voice cracked on the final word. He was begging for a denial he already knew I would not provide. I looked out the tinted window at the passing streetlights. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone perfectly level, devoid of any anger or vindictiveness. "There are no coincidences in corporate finance," I replied smoothly. "I am Harbor Vale Capital. I am the sole managing director, and I am the senior secured creditor of Rivera Mason Atelier." I heard a sharp, stifled gasp in the background. It was my mother. The silence that followed from Dean was heavy, thick with a suffocating mixture of profound shock and rising terror. He was desperately trying to reconcile the image of his unremarkable, disposable daughter with the ruthless financial entity that now held a legal blade directly to his throat. "You kept my company alive," he whispered, the realization slowly dawning on him. "You bought my debt 2 years ago. Why would you do that just to destroy it all tonight?" "I did not do it to destroy you," I corrected him, my voice slicing through the digital static like a scalpel. "I bought your toxic debt to protect the hundreds of innocent employees who were about to lose their livelihoods because of your grotesque mismanagement. I built a highly restrictive financial cage around you to keep them safe. And I maintained absolute silence for 24 months for one specific reason. I wanted to see if my own family would ever, even for a single moment, treat me like a human being without needing a financial incentive to do so." I paused, letting the absolute weight of my words settle over the line. "I gave you every opportunity to be a father. I gave you a fully funded runway to simply show up for me. Instead, you used the very capital I provided to mock me on a public broadcast and finance a luxury dinner while entirely ignoring my greatest professional achievement." Before Dean could formulate a defense, a frantic scrambling sound echoed over the receiver. Brooke had snatched the phone from his hand. The cruel, mocking socialite from the restaurant booth had completely vanished. Her voice was shrill, trembling with a pathetic, desperate panic. "Olivia, please," she begged, the words tumbling out in a rapid, messy rush. "You have to stop this. You cannot freeze the accounts. My entire marketing team is waiting for their retainers tomorrow morning. If those wires do not clear, my brand launch is completely ruined. We did not know it was you. We had absolutely no idea you were the one funding the company. If we had known, we would have never said those things on the live feed. We would have come to your banquet. We did not know." She wielded her ignorance like a shield, genuinely believing that her lack of awareness somehow absolved her of a lifetime of cruelty. She thought an apology born entirely out of financial terror could instantly erase decades of casual contempt. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling a wave of profound exhaustion wash over me. The sheer, transactional nature of her plea was sickening. Not knowing was the luxury I kept paying for. I told her, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "You did not mock me tonight because you thought I was poor. You mocked me because you believe I am inherently beneath you. Knowing my net worth would only have changed your behavior. Brooke, it would never have changed your character. I am no longer interested in funding your illusions. Hand the phone back to Dean." There was a muffled sob, a brief struggle, and then Dean's heavy, ragged breathing returned to the line. He abandoned the executive persona entirely and desperately lunged for the very last weapon in his arsenal. He reached for the heavy chain of obligation. "You cannot do this. Olivia," he pleaded, his voice trembling with a pathetic, unearned righteousness. "I am your father. This is your family. You are tearing your own family apart over a few misunderstood jokes. You cannot legally execute a corporate takeover against your own flesh and blood. It is completely unnatural. I stared straight ahead at the dark leather partitions separating me from the driver. The concept of family had always been a one-way street in the Rivera household. It was a holy covenant when they needed my compliance, but a meaningless technicality when I needed their support. Do not ever invoke the concept of family to me again, I warned him, the coldness in my tone finally hardening into absolute steel. Family is supposed to be a sanctuary. It is not an indefinite, irrevocable license to exploit, diminish, and insult people just because you share their genetics. You tore this family apart years ago when you decided my only value was being your silent subordinate. I am simply the one finalizing the paperwork. I took a deep breath. It was time to deliver the final, fatal blow. The lockbox and the accelerated debt were merely the opening maneuvers. I needed him completely paralyzed, stripped of any lingering hope that he could litigate his way out of this corner. Furthermore, I continued, my cadence shifting into a rapid clinical legal delivery. My independent auditing team finalized their forensic review of your secondary ledgers 3 hours ago. We did not just find covenant breaches regarding restaurant bills. We found a highly systematic pattern of fraudulent conveyances. I heard him stop breathing. The parking lot noise seemed to completely vanish, leaving only the sound of his sudden, absolute dread. We have fully documented proof that you intentionally mischaracterized operational cash flow to hide massive direct wire transfers to Brooks' personal accounts. You disguised them as legitimate corporate marketing expenses, using completely fabricated vendor invoices. You committed systemic financial fraud to fund your daughter's luxury lifestyle using legally restricted creditor capital. Dean let out a low, guttural sound, like a man who had just taken a physical bullet to the chest. He knew exactly what those fabricated invoices meant. He knew the difference between a civil contract dispute and a federal white-collar crime. The arrogant titan of industry was instantly reduced to a terrified, cornered animal. I am leaving you with exactly one choice, I stated cleanly, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. I am sending a binding term sheet to your legal counsel at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. You will fully accept the forced restructuring process entirely dictated by Harbor Vale Capital. You will immediately step down as Chief Executive Officer. You will surrender all equity in the clean, operational assets of the firm. You will walk away with nothing but your freedom. I paused, letting the devastating terms hang in the digital space between us. If you attempt to fight me, if you delay the signature by even 5 minutes, or if you ever try to contact me outside of official legal channels again, I will not hesitate. By 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, the entire forensic file detailing your fraudulent wire transfers and fabricated invoices will be sitting on the desk of the federal regulatory authorities. Your choice is very simple. You can either lose the company, or you can lose the company and spend the next 10 years sitting in a federal penitentiary. There was no booming defiance. There was no arrogant counteroffer. There was only the sound of his complete, unconditional surrender echoing in the silence. I ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the empty leather seat next to me. The heavy, suffocating burden I had carried for 34 years was finally completely gone. The surgical extraction was over. Dean Rivera did not sign the binding term sheet at 8 o'clock the following morning. Arrogance is a chronic, deeply embedded condition, and his particular strain was completely terminal. He firmly believed he could outmaneuver me. He spent the next 48 hours aggressively burning through his prestigious contact list. He made frantic, whispered phone calls from his private office to private equity contacts, wealthy golf course associates, and regional commercial lenders. He desperately tried to spin the sudden account freeze as a temporary administrative error, a minor legal misunderstanding that could be easily rectified with a bridge loan of $2 or $3 million. However, in the highly interconnected, ruthless world of high finance, toxic news travels at the absolute speed of light. My legal team had properly and publicly registered the default notices across all relevant banking channels. His corporate credit profile was instantly rendered radioactive. No sane institutional investor or wealthy individual was willing to inject a single dollar into an enterprise legally flagged for severe covenant breaches and currently under investigation for internal wire fraud. By the evening of the third day, the booming, unshakable confidence he had wielded like a weapon his entire life was entirely replaced by a hollow, echoing panic. He was completely cornered, and the walls were rapidly closing in. Despite the profound depth of my personal history with the man, I did not allow my deeply rooted resentment to infect my professional execution. Emotional vengeance is inherently sloppy. It burns down the entire surrounding forest just to kill a single, venomous snake. I had absolutely no intention of leaving a massive crater of collateral damage in the center of the city. I stepped fully into my legally established role as the primary secured creditor and initiated a highly surgical, incredibly selective asset carve-out. Rivera Mason Atelier, as a unified, family-branded entity, was officially dead, but its core operational organs were still fundamentally viable. I meticulously separated the healthy, highly functioning architectural drafting divisions and the reliable, hard-working project management teams from Dean's bloated, useless executive suite. I legally partitioned the solid, profitable commercial contracts from his toxic, mounting liabilities. Most importantly, I utilized the seized cash flow from the springing lockbox to establish an airtight, protected payroll trust. I personally mandated and guaranteed that every single past due wage was settled in full within 24 hours. Furthermore, I directed my legal counsel to structure a comprehensive severance package for the administrative staff. Anyone who had been employed for over 5 years would receive 3 months of full salary and extended healthcare benefits if their specific department could not be successfully integrated into the new holding company. This specific operational maneuver was the blade that cut Dean the deepest. The profound irony was sharp, deliberate, and entirely inescapable. Dean had spent his entire adult life loudly declaring himself the benevolent patriarch, the great, unmatched provider for his loyal people. He demanded total deference from his staff based on this grand illusion. Yet, in the final, catastrophic hour of his firm, it was the exact daughter he had deemed utterly useless who quietly stepped in to ensure his working-class employees could still feed their children and pay their mortgages. He was forced to sit in his dark office and watch me systematically dismantle his kingdom while simultaneously fulfilling the fundamental moral obligations he had completely abandoned. He was financially ruined, but more importantly, he was utterly emasculated in the very arena he valued most. Meanwhile, my sister was violently discovering the terrifying, unyielding velocity of internet justice. The live-streamed footage from the high-end restaurant did not simply disappear into the digital ether when she finally, frantically ended the broadcast. It was clipped, downloaded, analyzed, and shared hundreds of thousands of times across multiple major social media platforms. Her cruel, dismissive sneer as she publicly mocked a lowly office clerk struck a massive, vibrating cultural nerve. In an economy where millions of hardworking individuals were grinding through demanding administrative jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, her arrogant, unearned entitlement was absolute poison. Within exactly 24 hours of the disastrous dinner, her primary cosmetics sponsor publicly terminated her highly lucrative contract, issuing a sterile statement about values and community respect. 3 boutique fashion labels and a major lifestyle brand followed suit by the end of the same week, completely severing all ties and demanding the immediate return of their unreleased merchandise. Brooke desperately attempted to stem the bleeding by posting a tearful apology video, but her absolute inability to produce genuine tears, combined with her continued insistence that she was the true victim of a coordinated cyberbullying campaign, only accelerated the backlash. She was suddenly bleeding massive amounts of capital, entirely cut off from the secret corporate funding she had stolen, and simultaneously banished from the artificial digital ecosystem that exclusively fed her profound vanity. It was my mother who finally attempted to bridge the rapidly widening, silent chasm between us, though her underlying motives were entirely transparent. Carla completely bypassed my corporate email channels and directly called the concierge desk of my secure apartment building, leaving a desperate, breathless voicemail with the lobby attendant. She begged me to call off the aggressive lawyers, claiming that things had gone entirely too far and that we needed to sit down and remember we were still a family. I listened to the transcribed message once and permanently deleted it from the server. Her pathetic plea was not a sudden, beautiful moral awakening. She was not grieving the loss of a relationship with her eldest daughter. She was actively grieving the impending loss of her leased luxury vehicles, her expensive weekly country club luncheons, and the pristine, comfortable, heavily insulated bubble she had cowardly inhabited for over 3 decades. She was finally experiencing the sharp, freezing draft of absolute reality, and she desperately wanted me to close the window. I calmly chose to let the winter rage on. Dean, in a final, pathetic act of desperate defiance, liquidated a small, hidden personal investment account to retain a highly aggressive, notoriously expensive boutique litigation firm. He fully intended to bury my holding company in endless injunctions and exhausting discovery requests. It was a spectacular, tragic waste of whatever minimal liquid capital he had left to his name. His seasoned legal team swaggered into the initial mandatory mediation session, but their aggressive confidence evaporated entirely the exact moment my corporate attorney silently slid the comprehensive, 200-page forensic audit across the polished mahogany table. The accompanying legal paperwork was absolutely, terrifyingly bulletproof. Dean had inextricably bound his own hands with his careless, illegible signatures on the strict restrictive covenants 2 years prior. The forensic audit clearly and undeniably traced the exact digital route of the unapproved cash transfers, linking the completely fabricated marketing invoices directly to Brooks' personal checking accounts. It took his aggressive defense attorneys less than 2 hours to pull him into a private consultation room and bluntly advise him to accept my original terms unconditionally. Fighting the hostile takeover in open court would not just guarantee his total financial ruin, it would practically invite a sweeping federal indictment for systemic corporate fraud. He had proudly built his own trap, confidently locked the heavy iron door from the inside, and then willingly handed me the only existing key. Through the entire, brutal, and highly systematic dismantling of their public reputations and private wealth, I maintained an absolute, unbreakable silence in the public sphere. Various financial bloggers, industry commentators, and aggressive local reporters attempted to contact my executive office dozens of times for an exclusive statement regarding the hostile takeover of my father's firm. I issued 0 press releases. I posted no triumphant, vindictive essays on my professional networking profiles. I flatly refused to grant a single interview. By actively starving them of a messy, public, familial feud, I completely denied them the one specific thing they desperately craved: the golden opportunity to play the victim. If I had publicly aired our deep historical grievances, Dean would have masterfully spun the resulting narrative. He would have manipulated the press, portraying himself as the tragic, hard-working patriarch brutally betrayed by a vindictive, mentally unstable daughter. By keeping the execution strictly confined to the cold, undeniable, and sterile metrics of commercial contract law and financial insolvency, I entirely stripped him of his sympathetic audience. He was not a fallen king tragically betrayed by his bloodline. He was simply a negligent, highly incompetent debtor facing the brutal mathematical consequences of his own profound stupidity. The absolute deepest, most lethal cut of my retaliation was not a raised voice, a dramatic confrontation, or a tearful demand for an apology I would never receive. It was the terrifying, undeniable competence with which I completely rearranged the entire board. I did not flip the table over in a messy fit of adolescent rage. I carefully picked up the scattered pieces, ensuring with surgical precision that every single innocent bystander remained firmly standing. The administrative staff kept their vital health care. The junior designers retained their employment and their dignity. The only pieces that were systematically cornered, stripped of all their unearned power, and swept completely off the board were the 3 exact people who had built their entire existence on the fundamental assumption that I was nothing more than a lowly helper. I had not destroyed them. I had simply quietly and permanently stopped preventing them from destroying themselves. The ultimate climax of this corporate execution did not take place in a dramatic courtroom or a shouting match in a family living room. It unfolded entirely within the sterile, gray walls of a third-party receivership office on the 42nd floor of a downtown high-rise. The court-appointed supervisor had organized a forced asset sale to liquidate what was left of the estate. It was a bleak, windowless room filled with the scent of stale coffee and impending ruin. Dean sat at the far end of the long conference table, flanked by his exhausted legal counsel. His suit was perfectly pressed, a final, desperate attempt to project authority. He was still desperately clinging to the delusion that he could retain the core intellectual property, that he could somehow walk away from this disaster with the Rivera name still proudly plastered across the facade of the manufacturing facility. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open to admit the lead bidder. When I walked through the threshold, the oxygen instantly vanished from the room. I wore a structured charcoal gray suit, carrying nothing but a slim leather folio. I did not walk in representing Harbor Vale Capital, the shadow creditor that had legally forced his hand. I walked in as the sole managing director of a completely new, impeccably funded legal entity named Ashmere Operating Group. I did not enter that room as a daughter seeking closure, nor as an angry victim seeking a chaotic confrontation. I arrived as the absolute only person in the entire city possessing the liquid capital, the pristine financial credentials, and the unyielding legal right to purchase the healthy, operational organs of his firm free and clear of all his toxic liabilities. Dean stared at me, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open, the last lingering remnants of his arrogant facade shattered into microscopic pieces as he finally comprehended the absolute totality of my design. He realized, with agonizing clarity, that I had meticulously mapped out this entire acquisition months in advance. I had engineered a perfect, legally binding escape hatch, a brilliant corporate lifeboat designed to carry the hundreds of innocent, hard-working employees to safety. And I had deliberately, carefully ensured there was absolutely no seat on that lifeboat for him. Brooke was sitting in the corner chair, clutching her designer handbag like a physical shield. The magnitude of the transaction was entirely lost on her until the court-appointed supervisor began reading the finalized terms of the asset purchase agreement aloud. The supervisor detailed the immediate transfer of all physical equipment, the existing client contracts, and the commercial real estate leases. Then, he reached the section regarding intellectual property and branding. The purchasing entity, Ashmere Operating Group, the supervisor read in a dry, monotonous voice, expressly declines to acquire the Rivera family name, trademarks, or associated brand identities. Effective within 48 hours of closing, the purchased operational entity will be completely rebranded. All existing signage, digital footprints, and corporate communications bearing the Rivera name will be permanently dismantled and destroyed. Brooke let out a sharp, genuine gasp, completely devoid of her usual theatricality. Tears immediately began spilling down her carefully contoured cheeks. It was not the loss of the massive financial fortune that finally broke her. It was the total, merciless erasure of her identity. The prestigious family brand she had ruthlessly leveraged to elevate her own artificial value on the internet, the name she had used to demand free luxury goods and VIP access, was going to literally cease to exist. In a matter of days, her entire digital empire would be anchored to a ghost ship. The name Rivera was about to become absolutely synonymous with total financial failure and federal fraud investigations. Her social currency had just dropped to absolute zero. I sat down directly across from my father. I opened my leather folio, unscrewed the cap of my fountain pen, and began signing the dense stacks of transfer documents. My signature was steady, flowing effortlessly across the crisp white pages. With every stroke of the pen, I was officially securing the employment of the core drafting team, protecting the pensions of the senior managers, and permanently excising the rot that had nearly destroyed them. But more importantly, I was delivering a symbolic cut that inflicted a pain far more agonizing than the simple loss of money, I was completely erasing his legacy. I was taking the empire he claimed to have built with his own bare hands, stripping his name off the foundation, and proving to the entire financial sector that the company was infinitely more valuable without him in it. When the final document was fully executed and notarized by the supervisor, I stood up from the table. The transaction was complete. The company was officially mine. Dean pushed his chair back. His hands were trembling so violently, he had to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to remain standing. The furious, booming patriarch was gone. The cunning, manipulative businessman was gone. He looked completely hollowed out, reduced to a desperate, broken man staring at the absolute ruin of his own making. "Olivia," he whispered, his voice cracking, devoid of any anger or authority. His eyes searched my face for any trace of the desperate, eager child who used to beg for his approval. "You cannot just walk away like this, after everything. I am still your father." I paused at the door. I turned around and looked him directly in the eyes. I felt no rage. I felt no tragic, overwhelming sorrow. The space inside my chest where those chaotic emotions used to live was completely replaced by a smooth, impenetrable block of solid ice. "You were," I replied, my voice echoing coldly against the bare walls. "Before you mistook my silence for permission, I turned my back on him and walked out the heavy glass doors. I did not wait to hear Brooke's sobbing or my father's pathetic protests. I stepped into the descending elevator and pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened my contact list and systematically selected the numbers for Dean, Brooke, and Carla. With 3 deliberate, effortless taps, I permanently blocked them from all communication channels. They would never reach my personal line again. They would never access my corporate email. If they ever wished to speak to me, they would have to file a formal request through a team of highly aggressive corporate litigators. When I stepped out of the high-rise building and onto the bustling, sunlit streets of Boston, the cold winter air hit my face. I held the heavy leather folio containing the absolute future of a newly revived enterprise tightly against my side. I did not feel the sudden, explosive urge to scream in triumph. I did not feel the loud, chaotic validation of a cinematic victory. What I felt was something infinitely more powerful. I felt a profound, immaculate, and terrifyingly clean equilibrium. For 34 years, I had quietly subsidized my own emotional abuse. I had allowed them to constantly withdraw from my spirit, my intellect, and ultimately my bank accounts, while they proudly treated me like a worthless, disposable servant. Today, the endless cycle of theft was officially over. The ledger was finally permanently balanced. The absolute heaviest burden I had ever carried was gone, and I was stepping into the rest of my life completely, terrifyingly free. I no longer had to finance the very people who despised me, and that realization was worth significantly more than the hundreds of millions of dollars I now controlled. Thank you so much for listening to this entire story. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please leave a comment below so we can connect, share our thoughts, and build a great community. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can reach and be heard by many more people around the world.